So I can tell your age as to how well you sang or didn't sing those songs. The psalmist said long ago, as he gazed upon the same moon that adorns our night skies, "When I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, the sun and the moon and the stars, what are humans that you are mindful of them? Who are mortals that you care for them?" Since the dawn of humanity, the moon has occupied a central place in our consciousness. It feels close and intimate. It represents mystery. It's the source of infinite mythologies and endless imaginations. However, it's quite doubtful that the psalmist could have imagined what we have seen with our own eyes in our own lifetime. Those of you old enough to remember will most likely be able to describe where you were and what you were doing when we landed on the moon. Am I right about that? How many of you actually watched it live? For those of you who did watch that, what did that mean to you? It's awe-inspiring, really. Now, for those of you for whom it is only a historical event upon which you reflect, how do you think that the moon, landing on the moon, shaped us? And for those of you that think it's just a conspiracy, well, then there's that. Not sure why you came to the sermon. Apollo 11 definitely means different things to different people. There's last month, New York Times did a lot of articles on this, and one of them was called, "Is It Time to Play with Spaceships Again?" It was written by Dennis Overby, and he's the science writer for the New York Times. And he says, "To those of us who watch, the moon landings now seem like a faraway fantasy, a grainy black and white film running on a projector in the attic of our brains." Isn't that beautiful? For the first time in known history of the solar system, sentient creatures had crossed space from one world to another. And more than 500 million humans, the biggest audience in history, watched on television as Neil Armstrong stepped onto the powdery lunar surface. Those steps and that crossing can never be undone. And preserved in the lunar vacuum, the boot prints could outlast the race that made them. Amid all the excitement and nostalgia, he says, however, it is easy to forget that over the past 5 decades, we never really answered the central question, why do we want to go to space? Or why did we go to the moon? I'm not sure he answers that question by the conclusion of the article. But think about it. In all, 24 men and no women circled or landed on the moon from 1968 to 1972. And in nearly the 5 decades since Apollo shop closed, nobody has been back. It's like we ghosted the moon. Armstrong's words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," are familiar to us all. But has it been a giant leap for mankind or humankind? Now, clearly there's been tremendous benefits, technological benefits. In fact, one of the articles I read talked about it. There was such a race to make this happen, it was forced innovation. And that forced innovation actually drove so much technology and engineering that it really, in some ways, helped birth Silicon Valley as we know it today. The forced innovation of computers, of rockets. And it was an engineering feat. I don't know how many of you have seen the 2019 film Apollo 11, which has incredible footage. If you haven't, it's really something. I was just mesmerized watching it this week. And in watching that and also reading a lot about landing on the moon this week, we heard the words, "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." But we know now that it was anything but tranquil. Where they were supposed to land was too rocky. And so, due to many engineers on the ground and the brilliant piloting of Neil Armstrong, they were able to land in another place. But I certainly didn't know that they only had 30 seconds of fuel left. That's how close it was. An engineering feat. Also, a benefit was that 842 pounds of moon rocks, and the study that subsequently happened gave us a diary of the birth of the solar system, which we may have never been able to know before. And also a benefit is it brought the nation together. In fact, it kind of brought the world together in a particular way, as over 500 million people watched. Now, why did we go to the moon? Well, clearly, as you know, there were factors. Just a few. It was the Cold War, right? Sputnik had gone in 1957, and we got into a pretty big competition. It was kind of another kind of war. That's why it's called the space race. People wanted to fulfill what President Kennedy promised, that we would be on the moon by the end of the decade. That would be the 60s to the 70s. And then another factor, national pride. We wanted to be first. I'm not saying it was right or wrong, just making a statement. We wanted to be first. But underneath it all, let's put all those factors aside. Underneath it all, I think that there's a hunger to go beyond ourselves, to reach beyond ourselves, to reach beyond and stretch the capacity of our minds as well as stretch the capacity of our souls. And it's awe-inspiring. Is it any wonder that we have attached religious or at least metaphysical meaning to landing on the moon? So what I want to do in just a couple moments we have left together is to ask some questions for us to reflect on. How has landing on the moon shaped us? And I want these to be spiritual questions. First question I want to ask is, how have we, since that time, 50 years hence, how have we integrated science and spirituality? It's known to all of us that science and religion have never had a very easy relationship, unfortunately. But how have you integrated scientific knowledge into your own spirituality? The Washington National Cathedral. How many have been to the Washington National? A number of you? In the south nave of the Washington National Cathedral, there's what's called the space window. It's officially titled Scientists and Technicians Window, but it contains a thin slice of the center section of lunar sample 10057. The slice weighs 7.18 grams, and it's embedded in the center of the upper dark sphere in the window. The slice was donated to the cathedral by the crew of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Collins is an alumnus of the boys' school at the cathedral, and they went through all kinds of permission to get this to happen, but President Nixon finally gave his approval, and the window was dedicated on April 21st, 1974. And next to the window, there's a carved boss or like a little out. People know what a boss is? Like, think gargoyle. Like it juts out. That's a boss. Who knew? But the boss, there's an image of the boot prints from the moon. So this is in our national cathedral. How have we woven science, technology into our spirituality, our faith? Or like many, do we keep those as two separate compartments? Another question to reflect on. What is your relationship and our relationship between your spirituality or faith and your nation or your country? What's your relationship between your faith and your country? So, landing on the moon was, as Robert Bellah, the great sociologist of religion, as Robert Bellah would call it, American civil religion. By civil religion, he means a non-sectarian, non-denominational faith that American symbols, rituals, and beliefs are in some way sacred. Are you following me? Let me say it again. American civil religion, non-sectarian, non-denominational, but a faith that American symbols, rituals, and beliefs are in some way sacred. Now, landing on the moon played into deeply American exceptionalism, right? Now, by that I mean, and we're not alone in this in the world, every country thinks they're the greatest, but there's something about the American psyche that we are a city set on the hill, the light to the nations, right out of the scriptures. Of course, America wasn't even thought of in the scriptures, but that's another sermon. But seriously, this was an awe-inspiring moment for our country. And Bellah argues that Apollo 11 landing was arguably one of the most profound moments of civil religion. And even those who were opposed to the space program at that moment later admit that when they saw that happen, they were strangely moved. But how does that shape how we think about America and our spirituality? Thirdly, how did it shape our view of ourselves? Did landing on the moon make us more humble, like as those shots back on the earth look? Did it make us more humble, like we are so small, so insignificant in this vast solar system and these millions of galaxies? Or did it feed our hubris? That man could do anything, woman could do anything that we put our mind to. What's our backdrop? Humility or hubris? From tens of thousands of miles away, the earth looked like a globe on a teacher's desk. But the political boundaries are wiped away, and the blackness around it provides a stark contrast to the bright, lively planet hanging in the void of space. The earth appears as a whole system, interconnected and complete. Although we know intellectually that we live on a planet, astronauts have said viewing it from space gives them a unique understanding of how our world is a small, precious oasis in an expansive cosmos. So I ask us to reflect. Did landing on the moon and being able to see ourselves in a different way, did that help us with humility or with a sense of interconnectedness? And maybe a better question is, if it hasn't, could it? Let me ask you two more. One, did it shape or did it cause us to reassess our use of resources or realign our priorities? $25 billion was spent on the program, 4% of the federal budget at that time, and 400,000 people worked on it. That's a lot of jobs. But we know that like any program, like any huge event, didn't have the full support. Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who was a close colleague of Martin Luther King Jr. and tried to keep going his legacy, arrived in Cape Canaveral in Florida with a mule team and a delegation of the poor singing "We Shall Overcome." And he urged NASA's administrators to cancel the launch and spend the money to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, tend the sick, and house the homeless. In fact, Whitney Young, a prominent civil rights leader, wrote that some of those people watch men walk on the crater-pocked moonscape on televisions in rundown tenements in the ghettos of America. And they watch while plaster peeled from their walls and rats ran in the walls. In terms of priorities, how is it shaped? And how do we think as people of faith about what priorities are important for our nation in this moment, our time, our era? I may not have mentioned that I didn't have any answers for these questions. I'm just asking them. Because what I'm hoping you'll do is reflect and talk to each other. And lastly, how are we caring for our fragile earth, which we have nearly destroyed? Okay, that one is a leading question for sure. But how has landing on the moon helped us care for our own planet? Catherine Newell, who's a University of Miami religious studies professor, says this: one of the best parts of the Apollo program, which is sometimes forgotten, is the way that the images of Earth were incorporated into the fledgling environmental movement in the late 1960s and the early 70s. Astronauts and scientists and environmentalists all use pictures of our planet taken en route to the moon to make the point that the Earth is both unique and precious. Almost every astronaut who went to the moon came back having experienced a profound change in their attitude toward life on the Earth in general and humanity in particular. Several described it as a religious experience, and nearly all of them have tried to help the rest of humanity understand just how special our planet is. I want to end with a quote from Michael Collins. He was the third astronaut. He doesn't get as much press as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. But I didn't know this until I read and then watched Apollo 11, that he was the one that stayed in orbit the whole time that Buzz and Neil were on the moon. And that his greatest fear was in the reuniting of Apollo 11 with the station so that they could return. And in fact, I got an email this week that Ann Anderson, I don't think she's here today, when she read Connections, she wrote to me and said that her husband, Joe, they live here right at the Regent, her husband, Joe, was the navigator on the USS Hornet that picked up Apollo 11. And I'm sure there's other stories like that here in this room or connected like that. Michael Collins says, it is the view of the Earth from 230,000 miles away, blue and white with a smudge of tan, that made more of a mark on him. The thing that really surprised me was that it projected an air of fragility, he said. And why? I don't know. I don't know to this day. I had a feeling it's tiny, it's shiny, it's beautiful, it's home, and it's fragile. And wow, how prescient his words are. The fragility of our planet. For me, what spoke most powerfully to me as I was preparing for this is an ad in Time magazine, an ad by Volkswagen. You can't see it much, but clearly it's a picture of the moon and a picture of the infamous VW bus. And it says 1969, obsessed with the moon. And then this picture, 2019, obsessed with the Earth. And here's an all-electric VW bus. That says it all. And may it be so. May in 2019 we be obsessed with our planet, its health, and the help of all the precious human beings who inhabit this place. Amen.